Hi, class. This is going to be a macro view, a long view of our semester study. And it's going to be very quick and very general, but we will be working through these slides as we go along in our semester. So, just like when I'm trying to figure out a trip going someplace, I like to look at kind of the big picture, and then I like to get down into the uh, minute details. So this is just going to be kind of what I call stepping stones. And actually these slides are going to be, there's about 30 of them. These slides are going to be your memory work, and part of what we're trying to do in photo history is give you um, a boost to your visual literacy. And I was an English minor and took a lot of different literary classes, and sometimes the professor would give me a passage from a book and say, who does this sound like, or who does this remind you of? And it's the kind of the same thing in the arts. Everybody knows Mona Lisa. Many of you know Whistler's Mother. Um, there are certain pieces that kids pick up on in their schooling and their growing up, and so they have a visual literacy, and they can attach names, or they can attach a time period to certain types of pictures. And in this class, we want to have you concentrate on building up your visual literacy of different artists and or different styles, and be able to kind of spot what time period they may come from. So we have a phase in photo history that we call early experiments, and there were about 3 different photographers who were simultaneously closing in on the invention of photography. What you're looking at here is called the first permanent photograph, and the slideshow will have information, and this is in a file in your Canvas, so that you can look up the timeline and you can download it. I would encourage you to download it and print it and study it, so that you know who did what and about when. So this is by Niepce, and he's one of the French, there were 2 French and 1 English inventor of photography. It's a view from his window, and a very long exposure. This over here is a wall, and this is a roof. And they found out that this was his chicken coop, or his pigeon, whatever you call them, raising area. And this is another roof over here. This was an 8-hour exposure, so it was only scientifically interesting, very promising, but not very practical. So our next picture is a partner of Niepce by the name of Daguerre. And we're talking about 1837 here, and we're still in the early experiments. Daguerre was an artist who did scene painting, and he was very interested in trying to get a patent or try to get a um, franchise on photography before anybody else did. The English side of the invention of photography is represented by Talbot. And we have a very famous picture of his called The Open Door. And Talbot was a contributor to a type of photography that would develop into a major um, technique, and that was called silver-based gelatin photography. And it was his foundational work that allowed film to be invented and cameras to be able to take pictures and make negatives. And then from the negatives, we could make more prints. Both Daguerre and Niepce could only take one picture at a time, and they could not make prints. But Talbot was able to do it, and this one is 1843. We're going to enter into the first commercial photography, but even within the commercial vein, there was some artistic merit to some of them. So portraiture, after we had the early experiments, then we got into portraiture. And this is a picture that was probably a good 5, 10, maybe even longer minutes. And you'll notice that the photographer had the model rest their head on their hand here, because you can't just sit there. You have to have some sort of bracing for a very long exposure. And this is 1845, very early. It was using Talbot's Talbot type process. Now, under art photography, which is just starting to break ground in the late 1850s and 1860s, we have people with cameras that are trying and challenging themselves to create artistic images that are suitable for an art museum. Up until this point, that was not a reality. Uh, Photography was either scientific, experimental, or it was for commercial purposes to make money for a portrait photographer. Robinson is taking a picture here that we will study later, and he was trained as a artist himself, and so he posed people as if he was ready to go paint them. The 1850s saw the invention of the photographic stereoscope. And you think you're seeing double here, but really and truly, the camera is taking a simultaneous two different pictures at the same time. So if you could imagine a big box camera with another big box camera side by side glued together, and then looking out at the Parisian streets, and both shutters went clicking at the same time. This is what could turn into a stereo slide. These were put into viewers, something like what kids have that are called Viewmasters, but they're bigger. And so these slides could be put into a viewer, and the person looking through the viewer would get a very strong sense of three-dimensional. So that was quite a wow. And from about 1850 to 1920, thousands of stereographs were created and sold. Another thing that was a big draw to the portrait studio was called the carte de visite. And you can notice here that on one piece, one negative, you'd have 8 different pictures, and they could be printed over and over on pieces of photo paper, and then they could be cut to the size of a business card. And so you would have kind of, instead of having a printed business card, if you were a member of society, you would have a picture business card, or calling card is what they were. And this was a big fad. This swept through all of the major cities around the world. People wanted to have a business card or a carte de visite. That's about the 1860s. Well, 1860s reminds me of American Civil War, and this fellow Abe Lincoln had to get elected. And up until this time, we really didn't have any photographs in political campaigns. But Lincoln hired Matthew Brady to take his picture. And actually, this picture was put on buttons, propaganda buttons, election buttons. It was reproduced all over the place. And Lincoln was very complimentary to Matthew Brady and said that his Cooper Union, Lincoln's Cooper Union address, and Brady's portrait of Lincoln helped to get Lincoln elected. Now we have an example here of what's called a pictorial portrait. And we're moving on into the late 1860s. And we have a lady photographer by the name of Juliet Margaret Cameron. And she was a hobbyist, but nobody in those days could do photography unless they were skilled in chemistry and science. Cameras were big, and people had to make their own film. Then they put it into their cameras, took the pictures, and had to develop the film before the emulsion dried. So this is called wet plate photography. She was a British photographer. After the Civil War, the United States government wanted people to expand and go west. And folks back east said, well, hold on for a minute. I hear there's a lot of unfriendly people out there that are not welcoming European settlers. And so the U.S. government sent expeditions, and this is a type of photography that we call expeditionary photography. Fellow's name is Jackson, who took the pictures, and people back east had never seen some of these Western landscapes, and they were pretty amazed by what they saw. They'd heard crazy tales from mountain men, but they thought, oh, those are just exaggerated stories. When they started to see these things for themselves, it was kind of like armchair travel, even though they were, and this is a stereoscope, so even though they were back east, they could look and they could pretend and they could think that they were out west. Uh, this one's a little closer to home. My favorite canyon in Arizona is called Canyon de Chelly. And Timothy O'Sullivan in 1873 came through on an expedition sponsored by the government and took this picture. Ansel Adams would later say that he tried to take the White House ruins himself, and he couldn't match O'Sullivan's technical expertise, which is a pretty big compliment since this was 1873 and Ansel Adams would have been shooting it 50 years later with more improved cameras and better film. Um, Here you have some early scientific photography, and the fellow's name is Muybridge. And if you look at it, you might think to yourself, gee, it looks like frames out of a moving picture. We'll study how he did this, but you're kind of right. This was a precursor. This was an experiment that had to happen before the motion picture camera could be invented. So in a way, it was a early form of motion picture, 1878. Art photography in England, the UK, had two different camps to it. Robinson was in there. That was the one who took the picture of the sickbed scene. And then this is the other branch of art photography. So you had Robinson who was saying, I'm going to approach paint photography like I would paint a picture. And this is Emerson. And Emerson was saying, no, 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 I'm going to take the camera out. I'm not going to work with it in my studio. I'm going to take the camera out. I'm not going to dress up anybody or adjust anything. Whatever the people are wearing, that's what they're wearing. And whatever props they're using, those are the props that they're going to use. And he called his naturalistic photography. Later on, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston are going to rename it as straight photography, one that doesn't have any manipulations in it. Right around the turn of the century, we had the invention of the Kodak camera, which was a handheld camera, and people were able to start to participate. They didn't have to be scientists to do photography. And so they started to call themselves photographers, when truly they were just amateur photographers. They weren't trained artists. And that kind of offended the art community, the photo art community. And they seceded from that section of photography. And this is the group. The groups were called the secessionist groups, and they happened in England and Vienna, and Alfred Stieglitz had one in New York. And this is a type of secessionist. They didn't want it to look like a snapshot. In art history, Impressionism was pretty new still, and so part of the photo secession aesthetic was that you can have blurry pictures that are atmospheric rather than tack sharp focus. Um, Here's what the early snapshots looked like. And people were super excited about being able to record their own families. They would make up photo albums of important people in their life. They would take their camera, had 100 exposures that they could take, and then they sent it to Rochester, New York, and George Eastman uh, developed the film, printed the pictures, reloaded the camera, and sent it back. And then people would put these pictures in their personal photo albums. So you didn't have to go to a studio and be posed. You could take natural types of pictures. Now, the name Stieglitz is going to be one of the big names that you'll be hearing over and over again. And Stieglitz was a person who ushered in not just modern photography, but he ushered in modern art. He eventually married Georgia O'Keeffe, who was a very famous American modern painter. And Stieglitz championed the time period was about 1900 to about 1940. And this was a period of modernism that we're going to get into. This is called the steerage, and it does have subject matter content. This is the high paid passengers up here on the top, and these are the low paid passengers down here. That's called steerage. The tickets were much cheaper down below. And so there was some social commentary going on here. But what Stieglitz was so proud of was that it was the composition of the picture with diagonal lines, with repeating vertical lines, with ovals here, with the X of the the suspenders here. This was a time when people were looking for geometry in their compositions, and they wanted their photographs to stand on their feet, both in subject matter and in what we call design composition. If you've taken two-dimensional design, you'll know what I'm talking about. Early in the American industrial scene, we had a very bleak period when we had child labor. And Lewis Hine was one of the people who kind of ushered in a type of photojournalism and brought these sad stories out of the behind the walls of these factories or underground in the coal mines or wherever he found kids at work. And he worked with a political party called the Progressive Party to try and end this misuse of childhood. And eventually they did pass some laws about it. You'll read all about this period. It's a type of photography that now we call documentary photography. In the 1930s, we had an interesting character by the name of Moholy-Nagy, and he stood up on his soapbox and he addressed all of the other photographers and he said, we're not doing anything original. Everybody is copying some form of artist who works with a paintbrush. And he said, photography is made with a new tool. It's made in a new age. We're going to do new vision photography. And what's interesting, I told you a little bit earlier, we had pictures being judged on their design qualities, elements, and principles of art, not so much on subject matter. And Moholy-Nagy did that with this picture here. And you'll learn a little later on that this wasn't even taken with a camera. It was created in the darkroom. Man Ray was an American artist who went to Europe and hung out with all of the really cool artists in the 1930s, Ernest Hemingway and Pablo Picasso, and you know, Paris in the 1920s was really a happening place. So Man Ray was over there, and surrealism was being created by the art crowd in poetry, in happenings like drama, and in photography. So Man Ray is going to be our representative of surreal photography. Um, this guy is called At Jet, and he was a very humble photographer. He never achieved any fame in his lifetime, but thanks to one of the surrealists, uh, they rescued his work from literally from being thrown away into the trash. They pulled it off of the sidewalk after he was evicted from his studio because he didn't have any money. And somebody saved a whole big box of his negatives. And in the 1960s, well after his death, he became very famous. So we'll be taking a look at Jet. Closer to home, this is Yosemite Valley, and you've probably seen calendars that feature Ansel Adams' work. This is the Half Dome picture. It was done in 1927. We're going to spend a whole class on Adams because he was such a multifaceted and a talented photographer that was doing many different things. He had his fingers in a lot of different pies. F-64 school. And his partner, they didn't really live too close together, but they did meet in San Francisco, the F-64 group. And if Ansel Adams looked up to anybody, he looked up to Edward Weston. And this is a type of modernist photography. It works on two levels. It is a green pepper. You can't deny it. It is a green pepper. But it also looks like a piece of modern sculpture. And some of my students have seen it as an embrace of two lovers who are embracing each other. So Edward Weston said that he was trying to kind of go beneath the surface of naming things and try and find out some universal truths that existed. So closer to Jungian psychology with archetypes. A very talented photojournalist is Cartier-Bresson, and he's French, sounds French. He had training in his youth with drawing and painting, but then he got attracted to the magic of photography. And what we're going to study about him is his wonderful compositions that he has. And you may, if you've been in photography at all, you may have heard a phrase called the decisive moment. And that is a reference to a book of pictures by Cartier-Bresson. 1930s USA, it was an unhappy time. It was the American Depression. And Dorothea Lange was recording the hard times that the Okies were having. They were being displaced by the Dust Bowl. They were migrating to California. They were not welcome in California, but they had to search out a living any way they could. The name of the movie or the book, perhaps you've seen or you've read, is called The Grapes of Wrath. And the author, John Steinbeck, studied many of the pictures of Dorothea Lange to help him create a more accurate picture of the Great Depression. Now, modern photography, Moholy-Nagy came to the United States and he opened up a school in Illinois that was called the New Bauhaus, and Harry Callahan studied with him. After a while, Moholy-Nagy said, "Well, Harry, I think I want to have you on the teaching staff." So we will be taking a look at Harry Callahan. This is the 1940s, and it's a type of abstract photography. So we'll be looking at that. Another photojournalist is W. Eugene Smith. And Smith worked off and on for Life magazine for the 40s and the 50s. I think he even up into the 60s. He had kind of a rough time. He was a perfectionist, probably obsessive compulsive. He was very temperamental to work with, but when he took a project on, he really, really did a wonderful job. And Life magazine owes an awful lot to several of the photo stories that Smith did for them. Another picture that is pretty famous is called The Family, and it's by Paul Strand. And Paul Strand is going to span the time period from Alfred Stieglitz, right around the turn of the century, into the 1960s. He was very dedicated to the working person, to the working man, and he didn't have any room in his archives for anything fancy. It was all based on the worker. Somebody else that kind of came to our country, this was a Swiss fellow by the name of Robert Frank. And he thought that when he came here from war-torn Europe, the aftermath of World War II, he thought everybody in the United States was rich, and he wasn't ready to confront problems that people had in the United States. This was taken in New Orleans. It was taken in 1955, and you'll notice that there is a very clear uh, mark. We have Anglo, where we have white people at the front, and we have African American people at the back. So this was even before the civil rights protests, and we still had segregation in a number of our cities. Robert Frank was not at all condoning this. In fact, he was trying to bring it to the attention of the rest of America and saying, this isn't right. And he published a book called The Americans, and nobody in the United States would publish it. He had to go to France to publish it. When the 1960s came about, and all of a sudden young people started to question authority and they started to support the civil rights movement, the book called The Americans was a hot topic in conversation among young people. Got to throw in Richard Avedon here. He was a commercial photographer, but he did have one foot in the world of art photography as well. So we'll be looking at Richard Avedon. And then in the 1960s, we had a big shakeup, and photography that had been dominated by the F-64 group, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, they kind of got knocked off of the top of the hill, and Jerry Uelsmann was one of the 1960s photographers that took over. And this is a form of neo-surrealism, and it's a blending together of different negatives to make a dreamlike image. Very popular these days in Photoshop to do this type of work, but Jerry was working in a darkroom with maybe up to 8 different enlargers and 8 different negatives, all working on one piece of photo paper to blend images together. 1960s. Um, Diane Arbus was taking her camera around and photographing what she thought was right and what was wrong about the big city. I think you'll enjoy looking at Diane Arbus's work. She led a very troubled life, and eventually she was a suicide